Welcome to Malcolm and We, heard exclusively on malcolmpresents.com. I'm Malcolm Berman, your host, and on the co-host is a lady with a long, I don't know, is it white hair, gray hair? I really can't tell.
Silver.
Silver hair, Yana Larson. And Yana, introduce our guests.
Okay, well, I have a very, it's kind of an interesting introduction, and so bear with me. Some people are supposed to be together. Gould and Paula Fitzgerald are two of those people, and some people are lucky enough to hold the matching right place, right time cards, and again, that would be Liz and Paul. What they have seen and done and written about is the stuff of great novels and films, and articulation of these experiences is only a very small part of their "we were there" reports, suitable for print and film, for the podium, for campfires, and beyond. In the years since 9/11, much has happened to bring Liz and Paul's life stories into shared focus. Their efforts at combining personal diplomacy with activist journalism is a model for restoring a healthy and vibrant dialogue to American democracy. As authors, their book, Invisible History: Afghanistan's Untold Story, lays bare why it was inevitable that the Soviet Union and the US should end up in Afghanistan and what that means to the future of the American empire. Leave it to say their projects are inspired by cosmic events, eliciting reactions of awe. In truth, one almost has to suspend disbelief because the revelations they have discovered will make one go, hmm.
Hmm.
Welcome, Paul and Liz, and you can start wherever you want to with the part.
Glad you mentioned the cosmic aspect of it because that kind of gives us a different idea of what CIA is. Cosmic intelligence. Okay. So you said it, cosmic intelligence, and that's what we have tapped into, and we're trying to help and as best we can the people we meet to understand the ideas behind cosmic intelligence, and that we really are all CIA agents in that sense.
Okay, Paul, explain. What is cosmic intelligence?
Cosmic intelligence, let's put it this way. Central in the CIA is an agency of the United States government. Central intelligence is what we all possess and what we all belong to. We are all part of consciousness, and we are sharing that consciousness in ways that as you go through life, you experience synchronicities, you experience coincidence, you come across people that you know you have a connection to, but you don't know why. Uh, and you discover after a while that you share more than just the fact that you like uh, the same kind of ice cream or the same kind of whatever it might be. Okay, that you have connections. Now I come from a very conservative Irish Catholic background a long time ago, and Liz comes from a very different kind of New Jersey Jewish background, and but we shared something in common that could only be said. We shared it in the greater space and of central intelligence, I would say, and we came to work with it. We found it very easy to work with each other. We both contributed different aspects to our experience, and are still doing it, and we'll probably do it for as long as we can.
Well, I would add that what we both came from was, I think we were both the youngest children in our family, and we really picked up the kind of traditional role of the youngest, where we seemed to be the one that seemed to understand our parents the best. I don't know if that's something that, means anything to you guys, but that idea that somehow maybe it's the caboose effect, where you're the mop-up operation, you know what I mean? And so we ended up recognizing in our families patterns that were far more important than our differences.
Yeah,
Okay.
how long have you been married? Or are you married?
Yes. We met in
We
1970.
made it legal.
And at 1970, and it was, quite dramatic. First time I saw Paul, was when I went to a preview production of the American rock musical Hair in Boston that was just opening up the next week because my roommate was connected to the production, and I got invited. And I looked at this guy on stage and I had kind of said, I think I want to meet this guy. Anyway, so eventually, we found each other, and but we started off, appearing as if we had great differences. Paul mentioned the Irish Catholic conservative family, traditional, and I came from a very, very, I'd say, left-leaning, liberal kind of traditional Jewish family, very intellectual, no sports. Paul was all sports. So I said, a lot of the markers that you would say, well, where is the compatibility here? And the one thing that we had in common at that point that I think really started that foundation of talking, which is really what it was about. We had a lot to say to each other, had a lot to analyze and look at the world. And at that point, we did it very geopolitically. I came out of that and Paul came out of that. But what was interesting, as Paul just said about, cosmic intelligence and where we are now, we ended up at some point realizing we had to open up to another way of knowing because we really couldn't find all the answers in the geopolitics.
Well, it's a little joke. David, ever heard the comedian David Steinberg?
Oh, sure, I remember.
David Steinberg before comes from a very religious background, Jewish religious background. I think his father was a rabbi and he studied to become a rabbi, but eventually he went into stand-up comedy, and I think he does direction. He winds up marrying a Catholic girl. I don't know if she's Irish Catholic or Italian Catholic, but she was from a Catholic family. And Steinberg is on the Johnny Carson show. And Johnny Carson says, David, how's it working out? She's, Catholic and you're Jewish. And David Steinberg says, it's perfect. And why is it perfect? She says, I teach her sin and she teaches me guilt. That's the opposite end of the coin. So anyway, that's just an aside. So
that's not their story, though.
I know. But I was interested to see that you were the first American journalist into Afghanistan after the Russians invaded.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, it was actually a little bit of a story before that. We had actually been working a lot in creating a documentary about the arms race and about détente and about the Soviet Union and the U.S. coming together. This was mid 1970s, and the Vietnam War was coming to an end, and there was a lot of hope that we were moving out of the war mode and into this peace relationship in a more peaceful world. And so we, at that time, Paul's cousin Ed Markey was actually running for office as congressman for the first time, and he ended up winning the office. So we got very involved with the Democratic Party. We knew a lot of people, and we were working on this project about the SALT treaty. And what happens is, this is 1976, Carter gets elected, the world looks like it's going to peace. We thought we had ended the Vietnam War and we were going to be in a peaceful world. And all of a sudden, December 27th, 1979, the Soviets cross into Afghanistan, and Carter announces the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. And we kind of looked at each other when we observed what was going on in Washington and knew all these people pushing for peace. It was like it suddenly evaporated. And we wondered, what just happened? How is it possible that the Soviets crossing into a country that was so unknown and so tiny and in their sphere of influence, as it was referred to, could have triggered the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War? Even though I know it was 75,000 troops, and that is a big deal, but it somehow there was a disconnect. So that's how we ended up trailing evidence that got our attention way back then, that something had shifted in Washington, but it shifted not in an organic way, the whole movement away from peace. And that's what really sucked us into the story. When the Soviets when the Afghan government kicked out the Western media 1 month after the invasion, basically what it did is it opened up a vortex of possibility, and we decided to jump in as independent journalists to see if we couldn't get the first visa, and we did.
Well,
So that's how we got set up in the story.
And I had, after my cousin's campaign, after he won, we helped him to that victory. I got a job at a local TV station with a talk show as a public affairs host of a weekly talk show. And it turned out that television station was owned by Pat Robertson. It was part of Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcast Network. So I was their non-sectarian broadcaster. It put me in a very interesting in that particular case. And that's why we wound up doing this documentary, was because it was an extreme right-wing documentary about the Reagan agenda and how we needed this massive World War II size improvement in our defense budget.
That's what was running on the television that we were able to.
They were running it six times a day on WBC on WXNE. And I went to the general manager and said, I said, this really, you're violating. And I had already got an FCC person to come on the show and talk about the nature of broadcasting in 1978 and 1979. And so anyway, so I said, look, we really got to balance this with something. You can't be airing this thing as a public affairs message without saying something about the other side of the issue, about in support of SALT II, as opposed to attacking it all the time.
Yeah, it's amazing. As you're talking, I'm thinking of the news that I was watching this morning. I don't know if you guys have heard the newscast this morning. What happened?
What happened? Anything?
Which one?
There was supposed to be a meeting. Actually, there was a meeting between Zelensky, president of Ukraine, and Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And they were supposed to have this whole thing worked out with mineral rights in exchange for weapons and
security.
And they got into and supposedly they had an agreement and everything was set. And then they had the conference in front of the press, and the whole thing blew apart.
No, I hadn't seen.
And they were yelling at each other.
I heard that. I read that.
Zelensky were yelling at each other.
Right. It's actually it started out with Vance, and the whole thing blew up. And Zelensky was asked to leave the White House and leave.
Oh my goodness!
Is that right? Wow.
So
story.
This show is interrupting that whole thing. It's going to be headlines of the news, but
go back.
Your thing was 40 years, almost 50 years ago, and it sounds the same.
It's the same. Once again, you've got different agendas at work and different groups that are lobbying all the time. I mean, constantly for influence in terms of policy.
But it's the war agenda that I think we were witnessing, was how the war agenda gets framed into a reality, is aided and abetted in ways that peace is not aided and abetted. Let's put it that way. And we realized, especially when it came to the realizing, because when we followed through with the visa that came because of the documentary, and we were focused on this issue because of the documentary. So that's why I said we witnessed this unusual instant story framing. The narrative was already written. It was clear to us before they could have ever researched, they could have ever investigated what really happened. So
when we decided to do this documentary and we got approval to do it, all these people that were part of the local anti-war movement, Phyllis Morrison, Philip Morrison, all these Manhattan Project people who lived in the Boston area still and were teaching at local universities and had been since the end of World War II, they all called us up and said, "Oh, I have lots to say about this," So it really was, the whole world just opened up to us instantly. And John Kenneth Galbraith opened his living room and said, "Come in, bring the cameras. I'll talk to you about it," and about the expense of it. He said, "I managed the economy during World War II, Paul Warnke, the guy who'd written the SALT II treaty, he said, "Come down to Washington. We have a studio here. Interview me, and I'll tell you all about it." So it was like, wow, a whole world opened up to us because the mainstream media was kind of in league with the defense contractors in order to, in fact, in some cases, covert subsidiaries of arms contractors, and they were pushing this whole, everyone agrees in Washington that we need a boost in the military budget. The question is, how big? I remember hearing that one night on ABC News, and I said, Liz, it's already assumed that this stuff is going to happen. So that's what we discovered is that the agenda was already been prepared. It was already in the works, and that the Afghanistan moment basically opened it up for their pleasure so that they
I have
could.
to tell you, I'd love to see this. Is there a copy that I can get or
Have it online.
online? What was the name of it?
This was Arms Race and the Economy, a Delicate Balance. And that's online. And also, then we went to Afghanistan, and we did. CBS News hired us to go in and take advantage of our exclusive opportunity. And they didn't like at all what I found when I got to Afghanistan.
It didn't match the narrative they had written.
They were pointing out the narrative that, that the Soviets were going for the oil in the Middle East, and that Afghanistan was the first step in that direction. And so we got there and we discovered that it was a very complicated situation.
It had nothing to do with oil.
It had very little to do with the Soviet Union. It had everything to do with the local Afghan situation and the People's Democratic Party, which wasn't really capable of taking control of the government, but had in a coup. And so you had all of these opposing sides. And so that's how we wound up meeting. We did it in an involvement. We did a presentation at the Parker House in Boston, the famous Parker House Hotel, and friends of ours whom we had met, who owned the hotel, said, "Why don't you come in and display it? We'll invite a bunch of guests, and you can show your experience in Afghanistan." And so at any rate, one person who was invited, we said, "By the way, we've got Theodore Elliott, who was the former ambassador to Afghanistan, who also happened to be the American head of the Bilderberger organization, and who was also I believe he was the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which trains American diplomats." So as soon as I showed the documentary, I went up to the podium to start to talk, and Theodore Elliott started answering the questions that were directed towards me. So he eventually, and the guy, all of these old Boston Brahmins are about
7 feet tall.
Well, 8 feet tall, he looked like. At any rate, so he's standing up, saying, "Well, this is what's really going on in Afghanistan. And this is what's really," after we had just shown the pictures of what, the schools that they were starting and the educating women and and all these different testimonies of all the real things that were happening there. He started delivering the propaganda line about what was really going on in Afghanistan and how we were supporting these poor, defenseless Mujahideen freedom fighters who were battling the evil Soviets, atheist Soviets, for control of, the people's minds and everything else. So he finally turned to me and he said, "You are treading very closely to being a conduit for Soviet propaganda. I want you." So at any rate, I had tried to be friends with him. I tried to stay in the middle of the argument. And finally, there was a time in American history called the McCarthy era. And I went on and about the McCarthy era and what that had done to American journalism and what that had done to America's role in the world and about this whole idea of freedom of the press. And I said, there's no restrictions in an American going to Afghanistan and giving you their impressions of. And I said, and that's what I just did. And
Well, let's fast forward 40 years later, 45 years later. Have you been back to Afghanistan or have you?
Yeah, we went back in 2002 and we arrived at the same runway that we'd been down in 1981 and 83.
But we went with Seema Wali, who was our Afghan partner, who we had met in 1998. When she was actually the first Afghan refugee to come to this country after the 1978 coup that changed the governments in Afghanistan. and she was and her family, had to flee Afghanistan at that point. And she asked us when we first met her, she said, it's been 10 years since the Soviets left, and there has not been anything better happening for Afghanistan. Why? What is going on? Why can't we get the help we need to get our country back? And we had to sit Seema down and say, that was never the plan, Seema. Now you're getting the reality. And so she became a very dear friend of ours, and we consider her to be the voice of the Afghan people. And we have a wonderful presentation she made in 2003, actually at the Parker House, same room that Paul was talking about.
Wow, yeah. And then now, fast forward to 2025. What's happening there now?
Well, it's worse than ever. The worst people took over, which was always the plan. And this is all part of what's so tragic when people put so much hope in the claims that are presented about what America's purpose is for these invasions and what actually happens on the ground. And this is all part of our experience, realizing the narrative creation process that has been playing out for the American people. And when we've only focused exclusively to the degree we have on the Afghanistan travail. But what that gives you is the paradigm. And if you want to consider Afghanistan as the model, okay, in 2007, Hollywood chose to make Charlie Wilson's War as the film representing the final story, the final narrative of America's involvement in the Afghan tragedy. Now it was recognized as a tragedy that now is only worse. It's only far worse.
Remember that Tom Hanks?
Yes.
Yes.
And Julia Roberts. That, my friends, is a total propaganda story. Okay, that's what it is. It was the propaganda story. And, our work is, our research, is shocking for people.
We actually had the opportunity to meet and talk with extensively with the chief of the Directorate of Operations in the CIA for 5 years that managed the Afghan operation from Pakistan. His name is Chuck Cogan. And he showed up when our book, Invisible History, came out in 2009. He showed, we did an event in Harvard Square, and he showed up. He was at Harvard as a fellow. And he said, I agree with your position and your book. I've read your book. And I says, I agree with your position that the Soviets didn't want to go into Afghanistan, that they voted a number of 5 times to go. They voted no 5 times and finally relented. He said, but I disagree with what you said about Brzezinski intentionally luring the Soviets into a trap there. So so at any rate, 4 or 5 years go by. We talk about that particular experience. It was very important. So I said, let's call him up and let's do an interview with him. Let's see if we can get an interview with Chuck Cogan. So Liz calls him up and he goes, oh yeah. He says, come by my home. So he said, I'd love to talk about the experience. So anyway, I called the cameraman that we hired for that trip to Afghanistan, 1981. I said, you want to talk to the guy that ran the show? So anyway, so he said, yeah. So anyway, so he comes over. So we go over to Chuck Cogan's apartment it's right on the square on Harvard Yard. And anyway, so I'm throwing questions at him about what I want to talk about. And he said, can I say something? And I said, please. So he said, I never met Brzezinski.
Well, Brzezinski, by the way, was the national security advisor to President Carter, who was brought in by Carter when he started the administration and has been credited, according to his own statement, in an article that in an interview that he did in 1998 as Brzezinski claimed that he intentionally lured the Soviets into Afghanistan and that President Carter was aware of what he did.
But he wasn't trapping them. That's what he claimed.
Yeah,
so at any rate, he said, and Chuck Cogan was going around town telling everybody, oh, no, it didn't work that way. He didn't do that. Anyway. So at any rate, he says, he says he finally came up here for an event, and he said, I had a chance to ask him. He says, I agree with everything you're saying, but I disagree with that interview that they did with you, where they claimed you said you had intentionally lured the Soviets into Afghanistan to trap them. And he said, I did lure them in. It was intentional, and you didn't know over at Langley what we were doing at the White House.
Yeah.
Wow.
So she said, so here he comes to our event in 2009 to tell us, no, that's wrong. And then on a camera, he admits that, yes, you were right. Yeah. I was wrong. I didn't get a whiff of it when I was running the CIA operation for 5 years, 1979 to 1984. So, so here we got, so it was like, oh, Liz, you want to join the CIA? We are the CIA. We went and as I said, Central Intelligence, right? Cosmic intelligence. We went and we looked at that and said, it doesn't make sense. How many people have an opportunity to actually interface with the people that created that opportunity and then have them tell you, yeah, you're right, I was wrong. So it was really quite
American history too.
I think there might be a position in the government for you now to go and find out what the hell's happening.
Right. Well, I think what you just said.
Still in flux.
What we have an example of the reality of a process that forced us to have to realize that the way that history is formed, the way the story is formed, is not the way you think, not the way you've been told. And when you really get into the rhythm of the narrative creation process, and understand how there are systems that really come together and they begin to believe what they want to believe. And it's very powerful.
I even said to him at one point during the interview, I said, you could have worked with the Afghans. I said, even the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party, I said, they were kind of a quasi-Marxist. I mean, the Soviets never accepted them as a legitimate communist party. I said, there were all kinds of issues regarding their leadership of that country, which desperately needed leadership. There was no question about they were trying to get themselves out of a feudal environment that they've been stuck in for hundreds of years because of the British Empire. The British had locked them down pretty much and taken their sea routes. All what we call today Pakistan used to be a third of what was Afghanistan. Those are all Afghan tribes over the Hindu Kush. I said they had access to the Arabian Gulf. I said, there's no question that you could have worked with him. He says, oh, no, we needed to use it to get back at the Russians for Vietnam.
Yeah.
Really?
Right.
And he said, yeah. He said it was a small price to pay. Well, it wasn't a small price to pay for the Afghans.
I feel like it would be valuable now if you could just take a computer and a camera and go back there now and do things live.
In your pocket.
Well, that's what we did in 2002 when we went back with Seema
Well,
Wali.
we went back with a small camera.
Right. And filmed. And we created a documentary about her return.
That documentary's online too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but the problem is I used to do documentaries back in the mid to late 60s.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of my documentaries were like on PBS, and it was involving it was very anti-war.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is there was no if it wasn't for PBS, there was no other outlet that played it.
Exactly.
Because you couldn't get it on networks because networks only accepted their own work.
Exactly.
Right.
And you couldn't get in theaters because the only people that would see it were people that agreed with you.
Well, when we actually did our documentary with PBS, they made sure that as few people as possible would watch it. They put it on in very bad time.
Midnight on a Sunday.
Right.
And it's like, we heard it.
No question. Yeah. The word had gotten out at the highest level what the narrative was on Afghanistan, and PBS was very much in on that narrative.
Yeah, they were
very much. So even
we got a request from McNeil Lira at one point, and if they could do a story about what we had picked up, and they said, "Will the evil Soviets are doing this and doing that and doing that," and I said, "Do you really know what's going on there?" And so, but we finally did get them to do a kind of moderate, middle of the road story about the good stuff and the bad stuff that was happening, and who these people were, the Peshawar 7 tribes that were vying for control, and of course the drug dealing and all that stuff never got never got entered into the whole.
Well, yeah, I'd love to get you more involved with what's happening now, but basically in the Gaza and also with Ukraine. Are you working anything on those projects or?
Oh, no, we're actually very focused on the Fitzgerald history, the legacy, and the impact and importance of understanding the role it played in what really led to the assassination of JFK.
Oh,
Uh, that is really that ultimately,
Well,
and that's
there is,
part
and
of
it's kind of a mystical component to our
right.
story because
And a
when Trump
resolution.
came out and said that he wanted to restore the golden age, it fit right into what we were looking at in terms of the Giordano Bruno and John Dee and the Elizabethans and what the Fitzgerald family and our branch specifically of the Fitzgerald family came up against the British Empire and the creation of
in
the
the
British
in the
Empire.
in the
And,
16th
and
century.
the
are you part of that Fitzgerald with the
grandfather and JFK's grandfather were closely related. So,
wow. Okay,
so
I think we just ran out of time, but that's part two.
Okay.
okay.
Yes.
We're going to arrange it with
Well, we'll send you some things so you
yeah.
might have some questions to ask. We did some deep research into the Fitzgerald history that aligns with what happened to JFK when he especially got into the presidency.
Right, because now that's a big thing because with Trump coming into the White House, he wanted all the information about the assassination
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
released.
That's right. And what we have is actually more controversial than anything they could have in the White House.
I'm fascinated, but Yana,
Yeah.
make sure you book him for a second part.
It's probably going to be kind of hard to get them because they think you're really busy with everything right now. But I'm going to be bugging you, Paul and Liz. So be
Okay.
warned.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, you have all the info, so it's not a matter of research.
That's true.
Right. No,
And it's a simple thing now with the beautiful thing about the internet and Zoom is you don't have to have a whole crew down there, to doing the thing. I'm doing the interview with you. I'm in Los Angeles. Yana's in where are you?
Ohio.
Ohio, wherever that is. And then you're in the Boston area.
Yeah.
Anyway, guys, I thank you very much. Is there any email address or that they can contact you?
oh, who are you talking? You mean just to?
Our
Just
audience.
people, the general audience who want
We have a website. It's called valediction.net.
valediction.net.
Valediction.net, and it not only has all of our books and our work, but going back, we have the interview we did with Chuck Hogan is on this website. All the access to all the documentaries and everything. So depending on what you're.
Well, you've lived a very fascinating life and you've done a lot of good work. And
Thank
I'm so happy to meet you. And I thank Yana for introducing us.
Thank
you
you,
soon.
Yana.
And okay, thank you again. And remember, you're watching this on MalcolmPresents.com. The show is Malcolm and Weed. Tell your friends about it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
See you next time.
Bye.